US President Donald Trump issued an ultimatum to European allies to fix what he calls disastrous flaws in the Iran nuclear deal. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Iran says the United States crossed the line by imposing sanctions on its chief judge and is rejecting any changes to the 2015 nuclear accord. On Friday, US President Donald Trump waived sanctions against Tehran, but said he would not grant another reprieve unless the United States Congress and European allies strengthen the agreement. The US Treasury Department also placed sanctions on 14 people and entities. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says the US has failed to undermine the deal and hailed it as a victory for Tehran.
This guy, Mr. Trump, has been doing everything he could for a year, even since his election campaign, desperately struggling to destroy the deal. He hasn't succeeded so far. This shows the deal is solid, and it means a victory for international commitments. It means a victory for law over dictatorship.
There's much to discuss on the Iran nuclear deal. Joining us now from Massachusetts is Kaveh Afrasiabi. He's a political scientist and the author of the Iran Nuclear Accord and the Remaking of the Middle East. Here with us in the studio is Negar Mortazavi. She's a Washington correspondent for Iran International. From Reston, Virginia, via Skype, we're joined by Trita Parsi. He's the founder and president of the National Iranian-American Council. And Farhad Alavi is a managing partner with Akrivis Law Group, with expertise in U.S. sanctions against Iran. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Kaveh Afrasiabi, let me start with you. So Trump extends sanctions relief on Iran, but says that's the last time he will do it. He wants changes. He wants the U.S. Congress to change that deal. He wants European allies to change that deal. He's given them 120 days. Let me ask you firstly, in terms of international law, is this legal? Can the United States simply tear up this agreement, say, we're not going to abide by its terms any longer, we reimpose sanctions, that's it?
Well, in my latest book, I've devoted a whole chapter to the legal question and the relations between the nuclear accord and international law, delving deeply into international law and concluding that the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA is a landmark achievement of international diplomacy endorsed and embedded in the UN Security Council, as a result of which it has a UN dimension that makes it mandatory for the parties, signatories especially, to comply with its term, and is legally binding from the prism of international law. As a result of which, in light of Mr. Trump's reckless ultimatum, which we've heard before, Iran really has a legal card to play. It can even appeal to the International Court of Justice in order to get an advisory opinion on the legal status of this deal, which is, as I said, legally binding. In addition to that, even from the point of view of the U.S. law itself, there is a legislation, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which was passed in May 2016, and the U.S. Congress gave its tacit approval to the deal, which means that President Trump is dead wrong in thinking that he can issue an executive order and nullify the deal. That's not the case at all.
Trita, what is your view on this? We have here essentially an ultimatum which was put forward by President Trump. Can the deal be simply scrapped?
I think first we have to recognize that what Trump is doing with these ultimatums and these recurring ultimatums is that he is deliberately trying to destroy the deal without having his direct fingerprints on the trigger. What I mean by that is that he's creating essentially manufactured uncertainty around whether this deal can survive or not. That uncertainty actually works as a de facto sanction because it is one of the factors as to why international investments are not going into Iran to the way that it was expected, mainly because the banks are not willing to finance deals when they are not certain as to whether the deal is going to survive, and as a result, their investments may end up becoming sanctioned. So I think there's a sense in the White House that they can actually achieve destroying the deal without actually doing it directly, because eventually, if this continues, their calculation is that the Iranians are going to end up pulling out of the deal because they're frankly not getting much for being in compliance with the deal. I think that is the game that he's playing, because now it's the third or the fourth time that he does it. Every
Right.
time he does it, he says he's not going to do it again, yet he does it. So at this point, I don't think we can be safe saying that this is just another, luck, or the way that Rouhani has spun it and saying that this showing that the deal is, durable. On the contrary, I think this is a deliberate strategy by the American president.
What do you think, Farhad? I mean, the deal calls for sanctions to be lifted on Iran, this JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Has Iran seen any benefits?
It has seen some marginal benefits. I think, oddly enough, the Republicans and many in the Iranian government have, in a similar way, overstated the intended economic impact of this deal to their respective constituents. And this has created much consternation. Really, the nuclear deal was intended to peel back layers of sanctions that have been imposed over the past decade over the nuclear file. They did not repeal all underlying U.S. sanctions. And because of that, and because of the increasingly globalist nature of business and the banks' ties with the United States and American banks, they are taking a very cautionary stance towards Iran, and they do not want to deal with Iran because of fear that they could pollute their relations with the United States. On top of that, what perhaps is the most important factor is that Iran has not really taken the necessary reforms to absorb and make use of the benefits that have come about by this deal, meaning corruption is exceptionally rampant in Iran. There is really no ability for Iran to absorb this investment and have a trickle-down effect that is intended.
But does this agreement call, Farhad, for the removal of corruption in Iran before banks can deal with Iran?
Obviously not. However, banks, in order to be able to join the international financial system, have to take certain steps. And that's a purely private decision by banks, whether or not they choose to deal with an Iranian bank. And that is dependent on whether or not the banks they are dealing with, whether they're in Iran or any other part of the world, are clean enough, meaning they're doing due diligence on who they're banking with and picking up the right customers and doing the right transactions.
Then you agree broadly with what Trita was saying, that Trump is getting his way without having his fingerprint on this?
I think the administration, by many accounts, some would say, came into office effectively itching for a fight with Iran on this issue. However, is that the sole impediment to this deal? This deal was in existence a year before the Trump administration did come in.
Nagal, let's look at another part of that announcement that the president made. He also, at the same time, announced sanctions on 14 individuals and entities, including the head of Iran's judiciary. What impact does that have on Iran and also on, let's say, the spirit of this deal?
The human rights sanctions usually act as a symbolic move from the U.S., and the Trump administration was pretty clear that this was a provocative move, especially on Sadiq Larijani, the head of judiciary, and they wanted to send a very strong message to human rights abusers. And quite frankly, if you talk to activists and even the moderates and reformists on the ground, they're not fans of Sadiq Larijani. So the fact that he's sanctioned or put on a human rights abuser list, it has sent out a strong message. Iranians have, of course, the government has come out calling it the ultimate red line. But at the end of the day, this is outside of the territory and the scope of the deal, and it's not really much that Iran can be complaining when it comes to the U.S. compared to the other factors that were mentioned, the uncertainty that President Trump has created, that every 4 months this might all be blown up. So imagine if you're a big company in Europe, if you're a foreign investment and you want to enter this Iranian market, you don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 months. That's just not really good formula for business.
Right. Kaveh, there has been a response from the Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, to this latest threat from President Trump. Let's listen to that.
All of the world's nations, except for 1 or 2 countries and one hated regime, were of one cloth. Why? If we do not respect agreements, if we do not respect contracts, then we might as well say a prayer for civilization. I have said many times, in regards to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we have achieved successes that can never be taken away. No one can destroy them.
So, Kaveh, this is a multilateral deal. Other countries are involved. It was the permanent members of the UN Security Council +1. When President Trump announces this kind of threat, a threat of withdrawal, what kind of message does it send to the rest of the world?
Clearly a very wrong message that the U.S. cannot be trusted, and even some U.S. Officials who were involved in the negotiations, such as both John Kerry and Wendy Sherman, have explicitly stated that the U.S. is going to lose credibility with respect to other nations, including North Korea. But I really think that this damages U.S.'s global credibility altogether, and that's one good reason why President Trump wisely chose not to rescind the agreement and stick with it for the third time in his presidency. And my hunch is that, this will continue for the remainder of his presidency, and is simply bluffing and trying to minimize Iran's economic benefit from the agreement. On the other hand, the pressures on Iran through this JCPOA is part of the U.S.'s aggressive new Iran strategy that's called active containment, and is also indirectly targeting China, which is Iran's partner with the new Silk Road project, as well as Russia, which has been making inroads in the Middle East lately, and they're trying to reverse Iran and Russia's gains in Syria and the Middle Eastern landscape, etc. So you have to look at the geopolitical context and not view the tactical maneuvers on the JCPOA in isolation. I hasten to add that, in my opinion, U.S. and Iran have a number of shared and parallel interests, such as stability in Afghanistan and Iraq and anti-terrorism, that require a wholesale reappraisal of U.S.'s very destructive approach toward Iran at the present time, that requires, trying to gain market advantages from the nuclear deal and pursuing smart economics, which is sadly lacking on the part of Washington today.
Trita, can the fact that there are several other major powers that have been party to this deal, that are signatories, including very close United States allies like France, Germany, the United Kingdom, can it negate this threat that President Trump has made? Or does the United States have a great deal of power, financial muscle, if you like, to get its way?
Well, politically, you can clearly see how the Europeans have been very, very firm, and they've been lobbying Washington quite extensively to try to convince the Trump administration not to do what it's currently doing, and certainly not to pull the plug on this deal altogether. There is a small possibility that this deal could survive without the United States, but that necessitates not just that the Europeans are sticking to the deal and standing up for it, but also that European companies are doing so, because you can easily see a scenario in which the governments may actually stand by the deal. They may even provide protection for their companies, but the companies may nevertheless choose to not enter the Iranian market because they don't want to lose access to the American market. And as a result, again, the Iranians are not getting the financial benefits. That was clearly one part of the bargain here. And as a result, even if the European governments stand firm, we may still end up seeing the deal collapsing. That's why the European strategy has been so firm in trying to prevent that scenario from coming into fruition in the first place, because the best way of saving the deal right now is essentially to try to convince the Trump administration that it's simply too costly for them, mindful of the tensions that they will create if they go down this path.
That has signed the deal, Russia. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Russia will not support any attempts by the United States government to change this deal. Let's watch.
If now the deal is just put aside and Iran is told, you need to keep up with your obligations or we will impose sanctions again, then put yourself in North Korea's position. They are being promised the sanctions will be lifted if they give up their nuclear program. They will give it up, but no one will lift the sanctions against Pyongyang.
Does Sergei Lavrov have a point there? Because if the United States treats this kind of deal in this way, it's sending a message to other countries that it's negotiating with on nuclear issues like the DPRK, and saying, our word is not our bond here. Does Lavrov have a point there?
I think there is some validity to that statement. Yeah. There really is two issues here if the U.S. was to do this. One is that it would shatter international confidence in the U.S.'s ability to negotiate, and it would show that every administration could take turns and invalidate its predecessors' agreements. The second thing is it would be politically very costly and require a lot of political capital for the United States to persuade the other P5+1 members to really go back to the drawing board and review this once again. This was a very long negotiated agreement. I don't see that really happening at this point.
Right, the other point is, and this was a point that was made by the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson last week, in which he said that there is no better deal on the table. If we see a better deal, well, maybe we could go along with the United States, but we don't see a better deal here.
I think that's actually one reason that President Trump's own advisors, his national security team, and quite frankly himself have come to the conclusion up until this point that what is the alternative? He promised to fix this worst deal ever, and there's nothing that they could really do. And let's not forget that the U.S. Congress just had a 60-day period to reimpose the sanctions or to basically have the U.S. unilaterally leave this agreement after President Trump refused to certify Iran's compliance, and they didn't do it. This is a Republican-controlled Congress, and it was a pretty easy process the way it's put with the NR law and everything. And that didn't happen because, quite frankly, it's also the credibility issue, but also the alternative from a practical viewpoint. What else is there to do? Because the nuclear threat is actually what the main issue is that the Europeans even and the Democrats here are focusing on.
Trita, Iran has two enrichment plants, one at Natanz, which is going to be used under the terms of this agreement for research, and the other, which is Fordo, which has been shut down. It cannot enrich uranium for the next 15 years. And what President Trump wants is a permanent restriction on Iran enriching any uranium. Is that going to be acceptable to the Iranians?
There was some attempt in the negotiations to try to make the durability of this deal, essentially the length of these restrictions longer. The United States originally wanted to be roughly 25 years. The Iranians wanted to be no more than 5 years. They ended up somewhere closer to the U.S. position, but nevertheless, the issue is this. If you try to make permanent punishment here, then Iran would essentially have to accept that it would be a different type of a country in a completely separate category. You would have non-proliferation treaty members that have nuclear weapons, such as the United States, China, and Russia. You would have NPT members that are not nuclear weapon states, such as Iran currently, and many, many other states. You would have non-NPT members, such as Israel, India, and Pakistan, North Korea now, that are not part of the NPT and do have nuclear weapons. And then you would have one single category, a country in a fourth category, Iran, that is a member of the NPT, doesn't have nuclear weapons, but is permanently under restrictions that no other country is in. There's no way the Iranians would agree to this. They tried. It was a complete non-starter. The reason why Trump is saying that he wants this is precisely because he knows that the Iranians will say no to it. He's just trying to find a way to be able to portray himself as if he's seeking a reasonable outcome, whereas in reality, he knows that it's a non-starter and it is a fast track towards collapsing this deal.
Kaveh Afrasiabi, what kind of leverage do the Iranians have right now in countering this pressure coming from the United States? The Iranian Foreign Ministry says it will retaliate, but what can the Iranians do?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that Iran has a legal card to play and can complain against the U.S. to the UN Security Council and has very legitimate grounds to even take it to the International Court of Justice. In addition to that, we have heard from the head of Iran's atomic agency that Iran might reduce its cooperation with the UN Atomic Agency and resume its full-scale enrichment activities. And I agree with Trita Parsi that Iran cannot be treated as a second-class NPT member and has agreed to these restrictions on its NPT rights as part of a grand bargain in order to lift the sanctions. But we have seen very little of that as a result of the U.S. dragging its feet and so on. So Iran can use the mechanism within the JCPOA of the Joint Commission to complain that President Trump's latest announcement actually adds another thick layer of uncertainty over Iran and its trade policies. It inhibits foreign investment and so on, and that's a very big step against the nuclear agreement. And there's also the other scenarios such as stopping compliance with the JCPOA altogether, which has also been threatened by Iran. But I don't think that Iran is going to go that far, and we have heard from President Rouhani that as long as the other parties stick with the terms of the agreement, Iran will remain within the JCPOA, but will take proportional reactions to the White House's very counterproductive and destructive approach.
Farhad, just one point there. If Iran does restart its centrifuges and starts enriching uranium again, it then will be in violation of the agreement.
Absolutely, yes. And the agreement calls for a dispute resolution mechanism inside it. So there is a way to settle differences. But however, if it is deemed to be a material breach, then that would initiate the whole process of potentially snapback of where the sanctions will be gradually reimposed.
Now, what do you expect will happen then in the next 4 months? 120 days that President Trump has, basically, he's left the burden of changing this to the US Congress and the European allies.
Right. I think the inertia is really not there to revisit this deal at this point. A lot of it, I think, depends on domestic issues in the United States as well as domestic issues in Iran with the recent uprisings. How does that affect the balance, and what does that signal to the United States, at least, as to Iran's position on the global scene? One of the things I think is the reaction that the government has taken towards these recent protests might feed into the Trump administration narrative that is basically not so much about the deal, but really saying Iran is a bad actor, thereby meriting a revisit of the deal. Now, that's not something that is obviously shared by the other P5+1 members, but it is something to note. So odds are that nothing will change at the present, but that could obviously change.
So you think there will be an attempt here to conflate these two things, the protests and the deal?
I think that falls very much into something that will be consistent with the administration's tack so far.
Nagar, there is one other country that agrees with the United States position, that is Israel.
Who is not party to the deal.
Right, not party to the deal, but what kind of pressure is the United States coming under from Israel, which of course is not a fan of this deal? In fact, we heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say, fix it or nix it.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu tried from day one to prevent the negotiations from going forward, to prevent the nuclear deal from basically becoming the JCPOA. Even when it was going through Congress, he did very heavy lobbying here in Washington to the point that there was even a wedge driven between him and President Obama. He didn't succeed. At the same time, the Saudis were also in parallel trying to lobby against the deal, and that didn't happen either. So I think at this point, what we've seen until now is that this deal is a done deal, and even a good portion of the Republicans, the U.S. Congress has realized that. The president's own national security advisors have realized it. And also, I wanted to add to the issue of the protests. The protests in Iran were the main driving force was the economy. There's a lot of disenfranchised classes who didn't benefit enough from the post-deal era. So for the United States to come out and put more economic sanctions on Iranians and basically affect the population, including these protesters who are protesting against government, would give enough ammunition to the government to blame everything on the U.S. sanctions instead of fixing corruption and mismanagement that has caused the economy to go to the situation that it is right now.
Trita, there's something I want to clarify here, and that is this requirement that the United States periodically review and recertify, as it's put, this agreement. That is an internal U.S. requirement, isn't it? It's not part of the international deal.
It has nothing to do with the international deal. It's a result of Congress wishing to have an oversight over this. Some in Congress wanted this deal to be a treaty, and as a result, it would need it to be ratified by the Senate. The Obama administration did not agree with that, nor did any other country. So as a result, it ended up becoming a joint comprehensive plan of action. And the compromise then was that Congress would instead have some form of an oversight by the president having to send a quarterly report, making sure that they reported to Congress whether Iran is or is not living up to the deal and whether the deal continues to make sense for U.S. national security. This was not thought to become such a problematic thing because no one expected Donald Trump to be president. And I think from Trump's perspective, this is a recurring insult to him that every 3 months he has to certify that something Barack Obama achieved actually is working.
And Trita, what kind of sentiment is there in the U.S. Congress right now to revisit this deal and to probably change it?
I think there's a lot of rhetoric in the sense that there would still be a lot of criticism against it. And there's certainly some hardline Republicans that do want to kill it. But there's also a realization that it's one thing to call for it to be killed and have it killed by someone else, so you actually are not responsible, than to actually have it sent to Congress in which their vote would kill it, and as a result, they would also own the outcome and the ensuing disaster. When faced with that, you could clearly see that the Republicans back down, because as much as they might want to see the deal killed, they don't want to be responsible for the disaster that will follow.
Kaveh, you referred earlier on to the chief negotiator for the United States in this deal, Wendy Sherman. Now, she's advised against changing this deal, which I guess is something one could expect from her. She was partly the author of this deal. She says the agreement is popular in Iran and that any change would be, to use her word, a gift to hardliners in Iran. That's internal politics in Iran, of course. But does she have a point there?
Yes, I think so. And, Sherman was also extensively involved with the North Korea negotiations, so she knows her material. With respect to Iran, there's been a lot of criticism by, a whole number of people, including the principalists known as the hardliners, that Iran has given up too much in this grand bargain. And now if President Trump, fulfills his ultimatum, then that will probably cause a setback, political setback for the moderate President Rouhani, and the hardliner will see a historical deja vu, just like right after 9/11 when Iran cooperated with the political change in Kabul and then was rewarded with axis of evil by President Bush. So this would be seen as a serious betrayal of promise by the United States that has promised, per the terms of the Algiers Agreement of the 1981, to not interfere in Iran's domestic affairs. And yet we have heard reports from Iran that the U.S. is trying to destabilize Iran as part of its aggressive New Iran strategy, and stabbing at the JCPOA is a step in that direction.
Farhad, I've got about 30 seconds left. Realistically, what do you expect to happen in the next 100, or at the end of the 120 days?
I think the deal would most likely be recertified. Again, it depends, as I said earlier, on what happens domestically in the United States. There's a lot of things going on for the Trump administration, and similarly in Iran domestically, it's a very hot button issue what's going on right now, and I think that will affect the calculus, especially with this administration.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.